Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories. Jake Thompson sighed as he rubbed the back of his neck, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The dim glow of his desk lamp cast flickering shadows over the cramped back room of Pine Hollow Animal Clinic. It had been another long day of vaccinations, checkups, and a stubborn tabby with a knack for evading syringes. He reached for his coffee cold, of course, when the sharp ring of the clinic's emergency line shattered the quiet. He hesitated. It was past closing, and his assistant, Molly, had just left. After hours, calls rarely meant anything good. With a resigned breath, he grabbed the receiver. Pine Hollow Animal Clinic. Dr. Thompson speaking. Doc Jake, it's Mike. I found something. You need to see this. Jake straightened in his chair. Mike Jennings, the town's park ranger, wasn't one to panic. Is it injured? I think it's a pup, but something's off. It's tiny, no fur at all. Found it curled up near Ridge Creek. Looks like it's barely holding on. I'll be there in 10. Jake grabbed his medical bag and shrugged into his coat before stepping into the cold night. Pine Hollow was a quiet mountain town, tucked away from the chaos of city life. A place where everyone knew everyone, and strays were more common than stoplights. By the time he reached Ridge Creek, the wind had picked up, rustling the bare trees that loomed over the water. Mike stood near his truck, a bundle wrapped in his old flannel shirt cradled in his arms. His face, normally hardened by years of outdoor work, was tight with worry. Jake flipped on his flashlight and peeled back the edges of the cloth. His breath hitched. The creature was impossibly small, barely the length of his hand. Its skin was nearly translucent, stretched thin over delicate ribs. But what unsettled Jake most were the eyes too large, too alert for something so young. Its limbs were spindly, its tiny paws barely formed. What the hell? Jake murmured. It was alone. No mother, no tracks, Mike said. I thought it might be a coyote, but... Jake shook his head, already running through possibilities. Severe malnutrition? A birth defect? He needed to get it back to the clinic. Come on, let's go. Back at Pine Hollow, under the bright glow of the exam room, Jake worked quickly. He checked vitals, listened to its fragile heartbeat, and prepared a warm incubator. The creature trembled under his touch, but its oversized eyes tracked his movements with unsettling intensity. Hang in there, little one, he murmured. Over the next few days, the pup, if he could call it that, grew stronger. Its appetite was voracious, its instincts wild. It didn't whimper like a dog, nor did it wag its tail. Instead, it moved with an eerie awareness, its gaze sharp, almost calculating. Then came the test results. Jake stared at the papers in disbelief. The DNA markers were unlike anything in his database. No domestic breeds matched. No wild canines either. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't even a wolf. It was something else. He ran the test twice. Same results. What are you? He whispered, staring at the small creature curled up in the incubator. The realization hit him hard. He had no idea what he was raising. Was it dangerous? Was it even supposed to be here? The ethical dilemma gnawed at him. He should report it. He should call wildlife officials. But the thought of handing it over, of losing the tiny life that now depended on him, made his chest tighten. And then, as if sensing his turmoil, the creature stirred. It lifted its head, those impossibly large eyes locking onto his. And for the first time since he found it, it let out a sound, a soft, melodic trill, almost like a whisper through the trees. Jake swallowed hard. He had a decision to make. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances and the unbreakable bond between animals and humans. Let's spread the message of love, hope, and the power of finding home in the most unexpected places. Jake Thompson's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the pediatric thermometer under the tiny creature's frail body. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, casting brief, eerie shadows on the exam room walls. Dr. Thompson stood beside him, his brows furrowed in deep concentration. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions, the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment, the only sound filling the space. Temperatures low. Hypothermic, Jake muttered, barely above a whisper. He instinctively pulled the warming pad closer, adjusting it beneath the creature's delicate frame. Its paper-thin skin, stretched over spindly legs, felt too fragile, like it could shatter under the weight of the world. Molly, standing across from him, exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Thompson. "We need to stabilize it fast." "IV fluids?" Dr. Thompson nodded. "Yes, but small doses. We don't know how its system will respond." His voice was steady, but Jake could hear the slight tension underneath. This wasn't just an ordinary abandoned pup. The strange proportions of its body, the oversized eyes still shut tight, the barely there fur, all of it was unsettling. Mike, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, finally spoke. "This doesn't look like any breed I've seen before." Neither had Jake, and judging by Dr. Thompson's silence, neither had he. Jake gently secured a tiny catheter, inserting it with practiced care. The pup, or whatever it was, barely reacted, too weak to fight. Molly adjusted the drip, carefully calculating the dosage. "I'll prep a blood sample for analysis," she said, already reaching for a syringe. Dr. Thompson hesitated before nodding. "Do it. We need answers." Jake tried to focus on the work in front of him, but his mind spun. Wheeler's Ridge. The old logging trail. He had hiked there dozens of times, but he had never seen stray dogs in that area, let alone a creature that looked like this. Something about this felt wrong. Then, as if sensing his unease, the creature stirred. Its oversized eyes fluttered open for the first time. Jake sucked in a sharp breath, his grip tightening involuntarily on the edge of the exam table. The eyes weren't like a puppy's at all. They were deep, reflective, almost luminous in the artificial clinic light. A strange intelligence flickered behind them, something raw and wild, something ancient. Molly gasped. "Oh my God!" Dr. Thompson took a slow step back. "This isn't a dog." The words hung in the air, confirming the fear that had been building inside Jake since the moment he had laid eyes on the creature. The realization settled over them like a heavyweight. Whatever they had just taken in, it wasn't something the world was ready for. Jake Thompson leaned back in his chair, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes as he stared at the strange creature nestled in the incubator. Despite the steady rise and fall of its chest, signaling stable breathing, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. This wasn't just any abandoned puppy. Dr. Thompson, equally perplexed, scrolled through breed databases on his laptop, his brow furrowing deeper with every failed match. "Nothing, no breed, domestic or wild, fits this description," he muttered, more to himself than to Lisa. Lisa, who had been adjusting the incubator's temperature, crossed her arms. "So what are we dealing with?" Jake exhaled heavily. "I wish I knew." He turned his attention back to the tiny creature. It was now curled into itself, its oversized limbs tucked close, its furless body trembling slightly under the warming blanket. Its large, closed eyes and delicate, spindly paws made it look almost alien. The clinic's quiet was interrupted by the distant chime of the wall clock. Midnight. Lisa, suppressing another yawn, checked the IV drip. Vitals are stable for now, but the way its muscles twitch it almost looks like it's dreaming. Jake studied the creature's tiny form for a moment before shaking his head. "Let's get some rest while we can. We'll need fresh eyes in the morning." Morning came too soon. The first rays of dawn filtered through the clinic's blinds, painting golden stripes across the floor. The scent of coffee filled the air as Jake took a slow sip, his thoughts already consumed by the mystery in the incubator. He turned his head toward Lisa, who was peering inside the incubator with an unreadable expression. "Something's different," she said softly. Jake was on his feet instantly, setting his coffee down with a soft thud. He moved to her side and immediately noticed the creature's skin had darkened slightly overnight, a faint pattern emerging along its spine. More startling, its paws, once tiny and fragile, seemed ever so slightly more defined, as if growing at an accelerated rate. Jake and Lisa exchanged a look. "That's not normal," he muttered. Just then, the front door chimed. Mike, a local wildlife ranger and longtime friend of Jake's, stepped in, the crisp morning air still clinging to his jacket. "Got your message. Thought you were overreacting," he said with a smirk. Then his gaze landed on the incubator. His expression changed instantly. What the hell is that? Jake's stomach tightened. That's what we're trying to figure out. Mike took a cautious step forward, his sharp ranger's eyes scanning the small creature. You said Carl found it near Wheeler's Ridge? Lisa nodded. No den, no other animals. Just this little one. Mike exhaled, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. That's near the reserve's restricted area. He paused. I don't think this is a dog. The room went silent. Lisa's voice came out barely above a whisper. Then what is it? Mike hesitated. I don't know. But whatever it is, I don't think it was meant to be found. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked at the fragile creature, then back at Mike. Then we better figure it out fast. Equals. The morning staff began arriving, their cheerful greetings filling the clinic with a sense of normalcy that felt oddly misplaced. Dr. Jake Thompson barely noticed. His focus remained on the tiny creature nestled in its incubator, its fragile body rising and falling with each careful breath. Lisa, now more awake after grabbing a cup of coffee, joined him at the station. Dr. Thompson, she said, peering at the pup through the incubator glass. I know we've both been dancing around this question all night, but are we sure this is a dog? Jake exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. That's exactly what I intend to find out. Lisa handed him the preliminary blood test results from their in-house analyzer. He scanned the paper, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. The white blood cell count was unusually high, and the genetic markers, well, they didn't match any known canine profile. Mike, one of the newer veterinary techs, poked his head into the room. Morning, Doc. I heard you pulled an all-nighter. What's so special about this pup? He took one look at the small creature and let out a low whistle. That doesn't look like any dog I've ever seen. Jake closed the folder and placed it aside. Neither have I, he admitted. Just then, Molly, their receptionist, walked in with the mail. Dr. Thompson, there's a message from Paula at the city lab. She says your genetic results came in earlier than expected. Jake took the envelope from her hands, his pulse quickening. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words that would confirm or deny his growing suspicions. Lisa leaned in. Well? Jake swallowed. It's not a dog. A stunned silence settled over the room. Mike frowned. Then what the hell is it? Jake didn't answer immediately. His mind reeled as he pieced together the implications. He flipped the report around, pointing at a particular line of genetic markers. According to this, the closest genetic match isn't a domestic dog at all. It's wild. Lisa's hand shot to her mouth. You mean? Jake nodded. A coyote. Mike let out a low whistle. No way. That thing, it looks nothing like a coyote. It doesn't, Jake admitted. But the DNA doesn't lie. It's a genetic anomaly, maybe a hybrid, or, he hesitated, staring at the tiny creature that had upended everything he thought he knew. Maybe something even more unique. Lisa folded her arms, processing the revelation. If it's a coyote, we can't keep it here. State laws require we notify wildlife services. I know, Jake said, rubbing his temple. But look at it. It wouldn't last 5 minutes in the wild right now. Mike shook his head. Still, Doc, if someone finds out we're harboring a wild animal. Jake let out a sigh, already anticipating the ethical and legal dilemmas ahead. He glanced at the small creature again, nestled in its blankets, oblivious to the chaos it was about to bring into their lives. Let's just focus on keeping it alive, he finally said. We'll figure out the rest later. Lisa nodded hesitantly, but Mike wasn't convinced. Just be careful, Doc. If this gets out, people are going to start asking questions. Jake knew he was right, and deep down, he had a feeling that this mystery was far from over. Equals we. Jake Thompson stood at the clinic's reception desk, flipping through patient records while the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. His mind, however, was elsewhere on the tiny creature resting in the back room, still too weak to move much, but stable. The morning had been a blur of appointments and routine checkups, but a part of him had been hyper-aware of the murmurs drifting from the waiting area. People were talking. Lisa had already fielded multiple questions about the so-called special puppy. From what he overheard, half the town had begun speculating, was it a rare dog breed? An abandoned exotic pet? Something out of a science fiction movie? Jake sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. The last thing he needed was gossip turning this into a town-wide mystery. The bell over the front door chimed, and he looked up just as a tall, weathered figure stepped inside. Frank Delgado. The old rancher removed his battered baseball cap, shaking off the dust as he took in the clinic with a knowing glance. Dressed in a faded denim jacket and mud-streaked boots, he was as out of place in the sterile environment as a wolf in a sheep pen. "Afternoon, Doc," Delgado greeted, his deep voice carrying a weight of experience. His sharp eyes flicked to Jake, then to Lisa, who was at the reception desk pretending not to listen. Jake folded his arms. "Afternoon, Mr. Delgado. What can I do for you?" Delgado leaned on the counter, his posture casual, but his gaze piercing. "Heard you got yourself an unusual case." Jake exhaled through his nose. Of course, news traveled fast in Willow Creek. Word gets around, huh? Delgado's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smirk. Always does. He tilted his head slightly. "I've seen a lot of creatures in my time, Doc. Sometimes things show up that don't quite belong. Thought I'd offer my 2 cents. There was something about the way he said it that sent a ripple of unease through Jake. Delgado wasn't one to spread nonsense. The man had a lifetime of experience tracking animals, reading the land like a book. If anyone in town could recognize something out of the ordinary, it was him. Jake hesitated, then nodded toward the back. "Come on." Lisa shot him a questioning look, but he waved her off. He wasn't about to parade the pup around town, but if Delgado had insight, he wanted to hear it. In the dimly lit back room, the soft hum of medical equipment filled the silence. The small creature lay curled in its blanket-lined kennel, its breathing slow but steady. Delgado crouched beside the incubator, resting his forearms on his knees as he observed the pup. A long pause stretched between them. Then Delgado muttered, "Damn." Jake's stomach tightened. The old rancher didn't answer at first. He reached out, careful not to touch, just watching the creature's slow movements. "This ain't no puppy," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt his pulse quicken. He knew that already, but hearing Delgado confirm it made the weight of the situation settle differently in his chest. Delgado exhaled through his nose, sitting back on his heels. "You ever hear stories about the wild dogs up in the hills? Ones that don't run like coyotes, don't act like wolves?" Jake frowned. "You're saying this thing came from up there?" Delgado shrugged. "I don't know what it is, but I know what it ain't. You send out any tests?" Jake nodded. "Blood work came back this morning. Closest match is coyote." Delgado's expression darkened. "Closest match?" Jake sighed. "It's not a perfect match. Some genetic anomalies. That's why I sent for deeper testing." Delgado ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, thinking, if this pup was found alone, that means its mother's missing. Or worse. He looked up at Jake, his eyes sharp with meaning. If you found one, there might be more. The thought hadn't fully settled in Jake's mind until that moment. A creature like this didn't just appear from nowhere. It had to have come from somewhere. Something had given birth to it. And if this pup was here, weak and alone, what had happened to the rest? Lisa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "What's going on?" Jake stood, rubbing his tired eyes. "Mr. Delgado has a theory." Lisa glanced between them before looking at the pup. "Oh, great. Another theory." Delgado chuckled dryly. "I get it. But you might want to start thinking about what you're dealing with before someone else does." He stood, brushing off his jeans. Words already spreading. People love a mystery. Jake nodded, a knot of tension forming in his gut. As Delgado made his way to the door, he paused. "Keep an eye out, Doc. If there's more of them out there, someone's bound to come looking." Jake watched him go, the weight of the words settling over him like a storm cloud. Lisa let out a breath. "Okay, that was unsettling. Jake nodded, staring at the tiny creature through the glass. Yeah, he murmured. It was. He had a feeling this mystery was only beginning. The clinic had finally quieted down, the last traces of the day's hustle fading into a comfortable stillness. Jake Thompson leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over his tired face. Lisa stood across from him, arms crossed, her gaze flickering toward the back room. "You're thinking about what Delgado said," she murmured. Jake sighed. Yeah, he was too certain. Too sure. He glanced toward the door leading to the back. If this thing's not a dog, not even a coyote, what the hell is it? Lisa didn't answer right away. Instead, she grabbed 2 steaming cups from the break room and handed one to Jake. "We'll know soon," she said. "But until then, we do what we always do, care for it." Jake took a sip of the coffee, letting its warmth settle the tension in his chest. Then, without another word, he pushed off the counter and made his way toward the back room. Inside, the tiny creature stirred in its kennel, its unusual eyes gleaming under the soft light. Jake approached carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. He unlatched the kennel door and reached in. To his surprise, the pup, if he could even call it that, immediately turned toward him, its small body stronger than before. Tiny teeth nipped at his sleeve in what seemed like playful curiosity. "Well, aren't you full of energy all of a sudden?" he murmured, cradling it against his chest. Lisa appeared in the doorway, watching with a small smile. "That's the most alert I've seen it all day." Jake nodded, his throat tightening slightly. For all his experience, he wasn't sure what to make of this. This wasn't a stray dog, an abandoned pet, or even a typical wild animal. This was something else entirely. Lisa stepped forward, scratching gently behind the pup's large ears. "Maybe we should try offering some solid food soon." Jake hesitated, considering. "Yeah, but I want to wait for those test results first. I need to know what we're dealing with." Lisa's expression darkened slightly, but she nodded in understanding. Just then, the clinic's landline rang, cutting through the quiet. Jake shifted the pup carefully back into its warm nest before hurrying to answer it. "This is Dr. Thompson." "Jake, it's Molly," came the familiar voice of the city lab technician. Jake straightened. "You've got results already?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Molly spoke, her voice measured but tinged with something else, something Jake didn't like. "We ran the genetic profile twice. And, well, you need to see this for yourself." Jake exchanged a glance with Lisa, his grip tightening around the phone. "Molly, just tell me." A beat. Then, softly, "It's not a dog, Jake. It's not even fully coyote." The words settled like a weight in his stomach. "What is it?" he asked, his voice quiet. Molly hesitated before answering. "We don't know." Silence. Lisa, still watching, frowned. "Jake?" He pulled the phone from his ear, his mind racing. She said it's not a dog, not even coyote. Lisa's brows furrowed. "Then what?" Jake set the receiver down slowly, exhaling. "They don't know." The weight of the words hung between them. Lisa crossed her arms, her eyes flicking toward the back room. "So what do we do now?" Jake ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't meant to be found. And if it wasn't meant to be found, someone or something might come looking for it. Jake Thompson gripped the phone tighter as Molly's voice carried through the line, laced with curiosity and something else. Something he couldn't quite place. "Jake," she said, "I think you're going to want to see these results for yourself." He swallowed, glancing toward the back room where the pup lay curled in its enclosure. The tiny creature, oblivious to the weight of its own mystery, twitched in its sleep, its oversized ears flicking at invisible sounds. Jake took a slow breath. "Just tell me, Molly, what are we looking at?" There was a pause. Then, in a measured voice, she replied, "It's not a dog, Jake. And it's not just a coyote either. Whatever this is, it's something else." A chill crawled up his spine. He turned, locking eyes with Lisa, who'd been eavesdropping from the doorway. She frowned, silently mouthing, "What?" Jake pressed the phone closer to his ear. "Define something else." We ran multiple comparisons, Molly continued, her voice tinged with unease. Its DNA shows a high percentage match to wild canids, coyotes, wolves, but there are sequences we can't place. It's like it has markers from something else entirely, something undocumented. Jake's pulse quickened. Undocumented? He echoed. Molly sighed. I sent the data to Dr. Novak for a second opinion. She's coming to see you, right? She is, Jake confirmed, feeling the room shrink around him. Good, Molly said. Because whatever this animal is, it's not in any of our records. The call ended, but the weight of her words lingered. Jake placed the receiver back onto its cradle, staring at it for a moment before turning to Lisa. Lisa, he said slowly, running a hand down his face, we might have a real problem. She crossed her arms. Define problem. Jake gestured toward the pup's enclosure. Lisa followed his gaze, studying the tiny creature. It's just a baby, Jake, she said softly. It trusts you. That's what unsettled him the most. Before he could answer, the front door chimed. Mike. The older man stepped inside, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something heavier. His boots scuffed against the floor as he approached, eyes scanning the clinic like he was already expecting something out of place. Heard you've got something special in here, Mike said, his voice unreadable. Jake tensed. News travels fast. Mike met his gaze. Not news, whispers. Lisa stiffened beside him. Jake frowned. What kind of whispers? Mike exhaled slowly, glancing around as if making sure they were alone. Then he spoke, his voice low. Few hunters out by Wheeler's Ridge said they saw something strange last week. Said they caught sight of an animal moving like a shadow too fast for a coyote, too big for a fox. They chalked it up to a trick of the light, but he looked Jake dead in the eye. They ain't so sure anymore. Jake's stomach turned. Because deep down, he wasn't sure either. He glanced back at the sleeping pup, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Something stirred inside him, an instinct, the kind he'd learned to trust over the years. He wasn't just dealing with an unusual rescue case. This was bigger. And he had the sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't lost. It was found. And someone or something was coming for it. By the time the clock struck 9, the clinic was in perfect order, the back room prepped, and Jake Thompson bracing himself for whatever answers Dr. Novak would bring. The anticipation crackled in the air, thick with unspoken questions. Lisa, ever efficient, had just finished arranging the examination table when the glass front door chimed. The woman who stepped in exuded the sharp, analytical presence of someone who had seen too much and doubted everything. Dr. Thompson, she greeted, nodding curtly as she set down her bag. I hear you've got quite the mystery for me. Jake gestured for her to follow. See for yourself. As they entered the back room, the pup's ears perked up immediately, its large, wild eyes locking onto the newcomer. The small creature had grown stronger over the past day, its thin coat filling in with tawny hues, its movements sharper, more instinctual. Novak's sharp gaze took in everything the creature's structure, its piercing stare, the undeniable intelligence in its movements. She crouched down, studying it through the glass of its enclosure, then motioned for Jake to open it. With careful hands, he lifted the pup, feeling the warmth of its tiny body as it wriggled against his touch. For a moment, Novak said nothing, simply observing. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out a small flashlight and gently tilting the pup's head. She murmured, tracing a careful line along its jaw, pressing lightly on its rib cage. Muscle density is higher than I expected for an animal this size. Look at the limb structure, longer than typical for a domestic breed. And those eyes, she leaned closer. There's something predatory about them. Jake exhaled. So, what are we dealing with here? Novak didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set the pup down, watching as it trotted confidently to the edge of the examination table, nose twitching, ears alert. Finally, she looked up. Jake, I don't think this is a dog. Lisa crossed her arms. We've figured that much out already. Novak smirked, but shook her head. No, I don't think this is a normal canid at all. Jake's stomach tightened. Then what? She hesitated, then sighed. It's complicated. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a manila folder, flipping through printed genetic reports before sliding a sheet across the table. Your friend Molly was right. The DNA doesn't just show canine traits, it has markers from species we can't identify. Lisa blinked. What does that even mean? It means, Novak said, this animal doesn't fit into any category we know. The words settled like lead in the room. Jake rubbed his temple, frustration growing. Are you telling me we've been taking care of something that doesn't exist? Novak shook her head. No, it exists. But if what these sequences suggest is true, then she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Jake, this could be something undiscovered. Or worse, something someone was trying to hide. Lisa's face paled. Like an experiment? Novak's silence was answer enough. Jake inhaled sharply, glancing at the pup small, vulnerable, unaware of the storm gathering around it. So, what do we do now? Novak leaned back, crossing her arms. That depends. How much do you trust the people asking questions about this animal? The weight of her words pressed into Jake's chest, because suddenly he realized he wasn't the only one looking for answers. And whoever else was out there, they might not want him to find them first. Lisa's voice was soft but steady. So what happens now? Dr. Novak exhaled, flipping to another page in the thick folder. Ideally, we transfer the pup to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center, one that specializes in young coyotes. Jake Thompson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The answer was logical, but it didn't sit right. He glanced at the tiny creature curled inside the carrier, its breathing slow and peaceful. We've already come this far, he said, voice tight. It's been through so much. Can't we keep caring for it until it's stronger? Novak shook her head. That's exactly the problem, Jake. The more time it spends around humans, the harder it will be for it to survive in the wild. She softened slightly. I know you care about this little one, and I can see you've given it excellent care. But it's not a pet, it's a predator. Lisa sighed, arms crossed. It doesn't even act like a coyote. It trusts us. That's because it doesn't know any better, Novak replied. Which is why we have to act fast before it's too late. The weight of her words pressed against Jake's chest. His mind flashed back to the night the pup had been brought in, barely clinging to life. They had fought for it, and now he was supposed to just let it go? Where would it go? He asked finally. There's a facility about 3 hours north, Novak said, flipping through her notes. Run by professionals who specialize in reintroducing wild animals to their natural habitat. If we move quickly, it still has a chance to integrate. Jake nodded slowly, though the decision felt like a vice tightening around his heart. The pup stirred, stretching its spindly legs before yawning widely. It blinked up at them with those bright, intelligent eyes, utterly unaware that its fate was being decided. Lisa bent down, brushing a gentle hand over its tiny head. You saved its life, Jake, she murmured. That won't change. He swallowed hard, then turned to Novak. Fine, I'll take it there myself. Her expression softened. That's a good call, Jake. But it didn't feel like one. The sun was low on the horizon when Jake loaded the carrier into his truck. The drive stretched ahead, 3 long hours of winding roads and quiet fields. Lisa stood beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the evening breeze. You sure you don't want me to come with you? Jake shook his head. I need to do this alone. She hesitated, then nodded. Just drive safe, okay? He gave her a small, tired smile before climbing into the driver's seat. As he pulled onto the road, he could hear the soft rustle of the pup shifting inside the carrier. He resisted the urge to reach back and comfort it. This was the right thing. The hard thing. And as the town of Willow Creek disappeared behind him, Jake tried to remind himself that sometimes the best way to love something was to let it go. The pup's transformation over the past few days was nothing short of remarkable. What had once been a fragile, trembling bundle of bones was now an active, inquisitive creature. It bounced against the enclosure's walls, its oversized ears twitching at every new sound, bright eyes tracking Adam's every move. Jake Thompson crouched down, watching as the pup clumsily pawed at the soft blanket Lisa had placed inside. A part of him swelled with pride. This little fighter had come so far. But beneath that pride was a gnawing anxiety. The town's curiosity was only growing. He'd spent the afternoon dodging well-meaning but persistent questions from neighbors, and the phone at the clinic hadn't stopped ringing. Everyone wanted to know about the special puppy. Rumors were spreading faster than wildfire. "They're not going to let this go," Lisa murmured from behind him, as if reading his thoughts. Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know." Lisa folded her arms, watching the pup attempt a wobbly pounce on its own tail. "Once the final DNA results come in, what are you thinking?" He let out a long breath, his fingers tapping absently on the side of the enclosure. "Dr. Novak is right. If it really is a coyote, it belongs in the wild." But his voice trailed off as he watched the pup curl up, its tiny nose tucking under its paw. "But you've bonded with it." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lisa sighed and crouched beside him. "Look, I get it. But the longer we keep it, the harder this is going to be. And if word gets out that you're harboring a wild animal—" "I know, Lisa." His voice was quiet, heavy. The pup let out a high-pitched yip, startling itself awake. It blinked up at them, stretching its spindly legs before trotting over to the edge of the enclosure, pressing its small nose against the glass. Jake couldn't help but chuckle. "I guess we wait for Novak's call," he finally said. Lisa nodded, squeezing his shoulder before standing. "I'll start locking up. You should get some rest." The clinic was dark, except for the soft glow of the fish tank in the waiting room. Jake sat at his desk, absently flipping through patient files, though his mind was elsewhere. The shrill ring of the phone cut through the silence, making him jolt. He snatched up the receiver. "Dr. Thompson." "Jake, it's Novak." Her voice was sharp, urgent. His stomach twisted. "You got the results?" "Yes." A pause. "Jake, we need to talk." His grip tightened around the phone. "It's a coyote, isn't it?" "Yes and no." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "I ran the samples twice to be sure. The pup shares some genetic markers with coyotes, but there are significant anomalies in its DNA structure. It's not a pure coyote. It's something else." His pulse quickened. "Something else?" Novak hesitated. "There's a chance it could be a hybrid of an undocumented subspecies. But some markers don't match anything we have on record." Jake leaned back, staring at the pup's enclosure in the dim light. It was curled up, its chest rising and falling steadily in sleep. "Jake," Novak continued, her tone deadly serious, "I need you to bring the pup to my lab first thing tomorrow. This isn't just about rehabilitation anymore. We might have something rare." A cold chill ran down Jake's spine. "Rare," he echoed. Novak's voice was firm. "I'll explain when you get here. But, Jake, whatever it is, I don't think you should tell anyone else just yet." His fingers tightened around the receiver. His gaze drifted back to the small, sleeping creature that had turned his life upside down. For the first time since finding it, Jake realized this wasn't just a rescue. This was something much, much bigger. Jake Thompson stepped outside, his white coat crisp despite the tension in his shoulders. The clinic parking lot, usually quiet save for the occasional pet owner, was now swarming with reporters and curious locals. Camera lights flickered to life, microphones thrust in his direction. "Dr. Thompson," a reporter from the regional news station pressed forward. "Rumors are circulating that you're keeping a wild coyote in your clinic. Can you confirm?" Jake kept his expression calm. "What we have is an animal in need of care. Until we have conclusive results, speculation isn't helpful." A second reporter chimed in, "But sources from the city lab suggest that this is no ordinary puppy. Can you comment?" He exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "We're conducting thorough evaluations with wildlife specialists. Our priority is the well-being of the animal, and we'll share information when the time is right." The murmurs in the crowd didn't die down, and Jake knew this wouldn't be the last of the questions. As he turned to head back inside, a voice called out from the gathering. "If it is a coyote, what happens to it?" Jake paused. That was the question, wasn't it? He glanced toward the clinic, where he could see the pup in its enclosure through the window. It was watching him, its big, intelligent eyes tracking his every move. "We'll do what's best for it," he said firmly before stepping back inside. Lisa was already waiting for him at the reception desk, arms crossed. "That didn't make them go away," she said, nodding toward the parking lot. Jake pinched the bridge of his nose. "I know." She handed him a clipboard. "Mike called while you were outside. He said Dr. Novak's tests came in, and she wants to speak with you immediately." His stomach twisted. Did he say anything else? Lisa hesitated. "Just that it's urgent." Jake wasted no time dialing Dr. Novak's number. She picked up on the first ring. "Jake," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "We have confirmation. The DNA sequencing shows coyote markers, but there's a genetic anomaly we can't explain. This animal isn't just a wild coyote. It's something else." His grip on the phone tightened. "What does that mean?" "There's no match in any wildlife database," she explained. "It could be a hybrid of a subspecies we've never documented. But one thing's clear, keeping it isn't an option." Jake felt the weight of her words sink in. "The best course of action," she continued, "is to transfer it to a wildlife sanctuary where specialists can monitor its development in a controlled environment." He looked toward the pup again. It had begun pawing at the glass, making soft, whimpering sounds. "I need time," Jake said. "You don't have time," Novak replied. "With the media attention this case is getting, authorities will step in. It's better if we handle it on our terms." Jake swallowed hard, his heart heavy. He had nursed this tiny creature back from the brink, watched it grow stronger, and now he had to let it go. "I'll make the call," he said quietly before hanging up. Lisa stood nearby, having heard enough to understand. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Jake." He nodded, but the ache in his chest didn't lessen. Looking back at the pup, this little fighter who had stolen his heart, he whispered, "I promised I'd do what's best for you, even if it meant saying goodbye." Jake Thompson pulled into the clinic's parking lot just as the first light of dawn painted the sky in muted shades of pink and gold. He turned off the engine, but instead of stepping out immediately, he sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The wildlife officers would return in 2 days. By then, he had to figure out the best course of action for the pup, one that wouldn't risk his clinic, his career, or the well-being of the animal that had unknowingly upended his life. He exhaled sharply, finally forcing himself out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of morning dew and freshly turned soil from the flower beds outside the clinic. Inside, the building was quiet, except for the low hum of medical equipment and the faint rustling sounds from the back room. As he stepped toward the pup's enclosure, he found the small creature already awake, its oversized eyes locked onto him. The pup's ears perked up, and it let out a soft, eager whimper. "Good morning, troublemaker," Jake murmured. Its coat had started to thicken, revealing the tawny hues characteristic of wild canines. The pup wriggled excitedly, tiny paws pressing against his hand as it licked his fingers. He sighed, conflicted. The bond had already formed, there was no denying it. But that made things even harder. By the time Lisa arrived, the clinic was already buzzing with early morning appointments. Jake barely had time to fill her in before the phone rang again. He glanced at the caller ID Mike. "I need to take this," Jake told Lisa. She nodded, already juggling paperwork and answering questions from pet owners waiting in the reception area. He stepped into his office and picked up. "Jake," Mike greeted. "I heard about the wildlife officer stopping by last night. That complicates things." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, no kidding. Novak's tests aren't back yet, and I don't know if they'll buy me enough time." Mike hesitated. "There might be another option." Jake sat up straighter. "I'm listening. There's a private wildlife sanctuary upstate, not government-run, but highly respected. They specialize in rehabilitating animals that don't fit neatly into the system: hybrids, rescues, even former illegal pets. I know the owner. If you want, I can make a call." Hope flickered in Jake's chest. "They'd take the pup?" "It's possible," Mike admitted. "They have the resources. But it'd have to be an under-the-radar kind of transfer, at least until we get official confirmation on what exactly this pup is." Jake exhaled slowly. Send me their details. I'll think about it. But deep down, he already knew this might be the only way to keep the pup safe. That afternoon, Jake finished his last appointment and retreated to the back room. He crouched beside the pup's enclosure, watching as it chewed on the corner of a blanket, playfully tugging at the fabric. If he sent it to a sanctuary, it wouldn't remember him. It wouldn't know that he was the one who saved its life, fed it, comforted it. But maybe that was for the best. Lisa's voice pulled him from his thoughts. You look like a man about to make a hard decision. Jake let out a dry chuckle. That obvious? She leaned against the doorway. I've seen that look before. You're thinking about what's best for the pup, not just what you want. He nodded, exhaling. Mike has a contact at a wildlife sanctuary. It's a long shot, but it might be the safest place for it. Lisa studied him for a moment, then offered a small smile. That's why you're good at what you do, Jake. You put the animal first. He looked at the pup one last time, knowing that in a matter of days, he might have to say goodbye. And despite everything, despite the connection he had formed, the battle he had fought to keep it safe, he knew that was exactly what he had to do. Jake Thompson jolted awake to the soft sound of whimpering. His office chair creaked as he shifted, blinking against the glow of the dim desk lamp. His neck ached from sleeping in the awkward position, but none of that mattered. His gaze immediately flicked to the back room, where the pup lay bundled in warm blankets. Lisa sat beside the enclosure, her face drawn with exhaustion. The clock on the wall read 3:12 a.m. It's been restless, she murmured, rubbing her temples. The fever's holding steady, but it's not breaking. Jake stood, shaking off the last remnants of sleep. He crossed the room and knelt beside the tiny creature. Its breathing remained shallow, each exhale accompanied by a faint wheeze. He placed a gentle hand over its frail body, feeling the warmth of the fever radiating through its thin coat. We need to do more, Jake muttered. Lisa hesitated. We've given fluids, antibiotics, and oxygen. We can try another dose, but it's risky. I know, he sighed. But if we don't act, we could lose it before morning. He reached for the syringe, preparing another carefully calculated dose of medication. His hands were steady more out of instinct than confidence, but his heart clenched as he administered it. The pup let out a weak, barely audible whimper, then curled deeper into the blankets. Lisa exhaled heavily and leaned against the counter. I don't get it. It was doing so well yesterday. What changed? Jake shook his head. Stress. Maybe something congenital. Or maybe it just wasn't meant to survive without its mother. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. He'd been avoiding that possibility all along. The minutes stretched endlessly, filled only with the occasional adjustments to the IV line and the quiet hum of medical equipment. Jake checked the pup's vitals again and again, hoping for any sign of improvement. At 5:00 a.m., just as the first hint of dawn crept through the windows, Lisa let out a sharp breath. Jake turned back to the pup. It had stopped whimpering. Its tiny chest rose and fell with more ease, the rapid, distressed breathing slowing ever so slightly. Relief flooded his veins. The fever's dropping, he whispered. Lisa checked the thermometer, her tired eyes widening. 102.4. It's going down. Jake slumped into the chair beside the enclosure, rubbing his face with both hands. I don't believe it. Lisa cracked a tired smile. You should. Looks like this little one wants to stick around after all. They sat in silence for a while, both unwilling to leave the pup's side. Finally, as the morning light filtered into the clinic, Lisa yawned. You need to go home and get some real sleep. Jake chuckled wearily. And let you take all the credit for saving this pup? She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. At least grab a shower. You look like you just wrestled a bear. By the time the clinic officially opened, the pup was still resting, its fever nearly back to normal. Jake remained cautiously optimistic, but knew they weren't out of the woods yet. He checked his phone, no word from Dr. Novak yet, but she had promised to call once she reviewed the latest test results. Lisa, now re-energized with caffeine, shot him a knowing look. So, what's the plan? The wildlife officers will be back tomorrow, Jake said, rubbing his temples. If Novak confirms it's a coyote, we won't have much of a choice. But, he trailed off, glancing at the sleeping pup. Lisa folded her arms. But you don't want to let it go. Jake let out a slow breath. I don't. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. Dr. Novak's name flashed across the screen. He hesitated, then answered. Dr. Thompson speaking. There was a pause on the other end before Novak's voice came through, steady but serious. Jake, we need to talk. The test results are unexpected. Jake stiffened. How unexpected? Novak took a breath. You're not dealing with an ordinary coyote. The clinic seemed to shrink around him, the quiet hum of the equipment suddenly deafening. He glanced at the pup, sleeping soundly in its enclosure, completely unaware that its existence had just become even more complicated. Novak's voice pulled him back to reality. I need you to keep that pup safe, Jake. Until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Jake Thompson leaned against the counter, gripping the phone a little tighter. Dr. Novak's words weren't a surprise, but they still hit him like a gut punch. The pup, now stronger, had begun to respond to them, trust them, and soon he would have to let it go. I understand, Jake said, forcing the words past the lump in his throat, but I need to be sure it's stable before any transfer. Last night was too close. Dr. Novak's voice softened. I get it, Jake. You've done an incredible job keeping it alive. But if this pup is going to have a real shot at survival in the wild, it needs to be with experts who specialize in reintroducing animals like this. Jake exhaled slowly. He knew she was right. I'll prep everything on my end, Novak continued. We can have transport arranged by the end of the week. Jake hesitated before answering. Let's see how it does over the next 24 hours. If it keeps improving, we'll move forward. After hanging up, he rested his hands on the counter and sighed. He had known from the moment he took the pup in that this was a temporary situation. But after the past few sleepless nights, after fighting for its survival, it felt so much harder than he had anticipated. Lisa watched him carefully. You okay? He straightened, shaking off the weight in his chest. Yeah, just need a minute. Lisa gave him a knowing look, but didn't press. Instead, she nodded toward the back room. Well, we should enjoy our time with the little guy while we have it. The pup was more alert than ever, its small frame already showing signs of regaining strength. When Jake entered the room, it lifted its head, ears perking up. Well, someone's feeling better, Jake murmured. He carefully lifted the pup from its enclosure, feeling the warmth of its body against his hands. It squirmed slightly, then settled as he gently scratched behind its ears. Lisa set down a fresh dish of formula, this time thickened slightly with soft food. Let's see if we can get it to eat more solid meals. The pup sniffed at the food, then hesitantly licked at the softened pieces. Within moments, its cautious nibbles turned into hungry bites. Jake felt a mix of relief and sadness. The stronger the pup became, the closer they were to saying goodbye. Lisa must have sensed his mood because she spoke up with a small smile. At least it's getting the best possible start. He nodded. Yeah, that's what matters. Just as they were celebrating the pup's progress, the clinic phone rang again. Lisa picked it up, and after a moment, her expression darkened. Jake, she said, covering the receiver. It's the local paper. They want a statement. Jake clenched his jaw. What do they know? Lisa sighed. Everything, apparently. The leak from the lab spread fast. Now they're asking about the legality of keeping a wild animal. As if on cue, the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot made them both glance toward the front windows. A news van. Jake scrubbed a hand over his face. Great. He turned back toward the pup, who was now dozing in the warmth of the blankets, unaware of the storm brewing outside. By noon, 2 reporters had called, and someone had posted photos of the clinic on the local online forum. The community's reaction was mixed. Some supported Jake's efforts, while others questioned whether keeping a coyote in town was safe. Lisa closed the blinds and locked the clinic doors early. This is getting out of control. Jake stood near the pup's enclosure, arms crossed. I know. The reality was sinking in fast. With this much attention, there was no way he could keep the pup here much longer. Dr. Novak's voice echoed in his mind. The sooner we can transfer it, the better. Jake sighed, turning to Lisa. Call Novak back. Tell her we're ready. Lisa hesitated, searching his face. You sure? He looked at the sleeping pup one last time before nodding. Yeah, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It's time. Jake Thompson stood in the back room, watching the tiny coyote pup sleep soundly. Its delicate paws twitched in a dream, its breathing steady, a stark contrast to the fragile, gasping creature he had fought to save just days ago. The confirmation from the lab weighed heavily on him. He had always known this was a possibility, but now there was no denying the truth. This wasn't a lost puppy. It wasn't something he could keep or train or find a loving home for. It was wild. It belonged to the wild. Lisa lingered by the door, silent but present, letting him have his moment. She knew him well enough to understand that this wasn't just another patient. This was a life he had poured himself into, a bond that had formed in the quiet hours of late-night vigils and whispered reassurances. Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It feels like I'm giving up on it, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. You're not giving up, she said softly. You saved it. That's what matters. He nodded, swallowing the tightness in his throat. He reached for his phone and dialed Ranger Moore. The phone rang twice before Ranger Moore answered, his voice brisk and professional. Dr. Thompson, I assume you have an update for me? Jake cleared his throat. The final DNA results came in this morning. The pup is a pure coyote. A pause. Then, I see. That makes things pretty clear then. We'll need to arrange for a transfer to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center as soon as possible. Jake's grip on the phone tightened. How soon? Tomorrow morning, Ranger Moore said. We've already spoken with the facility. They're prepared to take it in. They have the space and the resources to ensure it gets proper socialization with its own kind before release. Tomorrow, just like that. Jake exhaled slowly. All right, I'll make sure it's ready. Good. And, Dr. Thompson, Moore added, his tone gentler now, I know this isn't easy. But you've done your part. This is the right move. Jake nodded, even though the ranger couldn't see him. Yeah, thanks. When he ended the call, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. Lisa was already gathering a few supplies for the pup's final night at the clinic. So, she said, her voice carefully measured. Tomorrow, huh? Tomorrow, Jake echoed. As the evening settled over the clinic, Jake made sure the pup was as comfortable as possible. He prepared a warm nest of blankets in the enclosure, added a small plush toy, something to provide even the slightest comfort, and sat beside it for a while, just watching. The pup blinked up at him sleepily before scooting toward his hand, pressing its tiny nose against his fingers. Gonna miss you, little one, Jake murmured, scratching behind its ears. You fought so hard. Lisa appeared with a fresh syringe of fluids, setting it down next to him. You should get some rest, Jake. He shook his head. I'll stay a little longer. Lisa didn't argue. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze before heading out, leaving him alone with the pup. The night stretched on, and Jake remained by its side, his heart heavy but full of gratitude. Tomorrow would be painful, but deep down, he knew this was how it had to be. The small coyote pup sniffed the air, its tiny nose twitching as it took in the unfamiliar scents of the clinic's enclosed backyard. Jake Thompson crouched a few feet away, watching intently as it hesitantly stepped onto the grass, its delicate paws pressing into the cool earth. A sense of bittersweet pride filled his chest. The pup had come so far from the fragile, fever-ridden creature they had rescued. Behind him, Lisa stood with her arms crossed, observing the pup's every move. He's already getting stronger, she murmured. Jake nodded. He is. But deep down, he knew that meant their time together was almost up. For the next hour, they watched as the pup explored its surroundings, testing the limits of its new energy. It pounced clumsily at a falling leaf, then spun in a circle, startled by its own movement. Each time it wobbled, it quickly regained its footing, its wild instincts already beginning to surface. This is good, Lisa said softly. He needs this. Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I know. They stayed until the pup grew tired, curling up in the grass with a satisfied sigh. Jake gently lifted it into his arms and carried it back inside, its warm body pressing against his chest. As he settled the pup into its enclosure, a sudden knock at the front door startled them both. Lisa glanced toward the reception area. "Expecting anyone?" Jake shook his head. "No, but I have a feeling I know who it is." Jake opened the door to find Ranger Moore standing on the clinic steps, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his uniform hat. "Dr. Thompson," the ranger greeted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I got your update." Jake stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Come on in." The ranger followed him down the hallway, pausing at the entrance to the back room. Through the glass enclosure, the coyote pup lifted its head, blinking sleepily at the new arrival. "Well," Moore said after a moment, "he looks good." "He's made a full recovery," Jake confirmed, crossing his arms. "Strong appetite, stable vitals. He's ready." The ranger studied Jake carefully. "I imagine this hasn't been easy for you." Jake let out a quiet chuckle. "That obvious?" Moore's expression softened. "I've seen it before. People take in an animal thinking it's temporary, but sometimes the bond forms before they even realize it." Jake glanced toward the pup. "I just want to make sure he has a real chance." "He will," Moore assured him. "The Wildlife Rehab Center is one of the best. He'll be placed with other orphan pups, learn how to hunt, how to survive." Jake exhaled slowly, nodding. 3 days, he said. "That's what they told us." Moore adjusted his hat. "I'll be back then, and we'll make sure everything goes smoothly." The time seemed to pass faster than Jake expected. Each morning, he checked on the pup first thing, watching for signs of improvement, though he already knew it was thriving. Lisa ensured that its feeding stayed consistent, and they both followed Dr. Novak's guidelines carefully, limiting direct interaction to prevent further human bonding. But despite their best efforts, the pup still followed Jake's every movement, its big, trusting eyes tracking him from the enclosure. Every time he looked at it, the same question burned in his mind: would it really be okay without them? On the final evening, Jake found himself sitting beside the enclosure long after closing. The clinic was quiet, the usual hum of equipment fading into the background. The pup yawned, stretching its tiny paws before curling up in its blanket. Without thinking, Jake reached in, running his fingers gently over its head one last time. "You're gonna do just fine, little one," he whispered. "You're gonna be where you belong." Lisa appeared in the doorway, her eyes gentle. "Jake, it's time to go home." He swallowed hard, gave the pup one final look, and stood. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, just for one last night, they were still a team. The quiet hum of the clinic's medical equipment filled the back room as Jake Thompson leaned against the counter, watching the coyote pup in its enclosure. It had grown stronger, its once fragile frame now sturdy, its once hesitant steps now confident. Tomorrow, everything would change. Lisa stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression soft yet tinged with sadness. "Everything's packed and labeled," she said, breaking the silence. "The rehab center will have everything they need." Jake nodded, though his throat felt tight. "Yeah, it's all set." They both turned their attention to the pup, which had curled up on its blanket, ears twitching in its light sleep. For days, they had poured every ounce of care into its survival. And now, the inevitable goodbye loomed. Lisa let out a quiet sigh. "It's funny. I knew from the start this wasn't permanent, but..." Jake offered a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, me too." He glanced at his desk, where the manila folder sat, thick with medical reports, feeding schedules, and notes from Dr. Novak. Every detail of the pup's journey had been documented, meticulously proof of its fight, of their efforts, of how far it had come. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting golden light across the floor. The pup stirred, blinking sleepily up at them. Jake crouched down, reaching into the enclosure, and ran a gentle hand over its back. The soft fur, once so thin and patchy, was now growing and strong. "You're ready," Jake whispered. "Even if we're not." Lisa cleared her throat, straightening. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's gonna be a long day." Jake hesitated, then stood. "Yeah, guess I should." But neither of them moved. Instead, they lingered a little longer, as if holding on to these final moments before they slipped away. The next morning, Jake arrived early, unlocking the clinic doors as the town of Willow Creek slowly woke around him. The familiar scent of antiseptic and freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Lisa arrived, already making final preparations. By noon, the clinic felt strangely quiet, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the weight of the inevitable farewell. Jake conducted one last checkup, ensuring the pup was in perfect condition for transport. Its heartbeat was strong, its appetite healthy. It was, in every way, ready for its next chapter. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Ranger Moore arrived with a specialized transport crate designed for wildlife relocation. He greeted them with a nod, his expression professional but kind. "Everything set?" Jake exhaled slowly. "Yeah, he's good to go." Lisa stood beside him as they carefully transferred the pup into the crate. It let out a small, curious whimper, peering up at them with those same trusting eyes. Jake swallowed hard. "Take good care of him." Moore gave him a firm nod. "He's in the best hands." And just like that, the door of the crate clicked shut, and the pup was on its way. Jake and Lisa stood in silence as they watched the vehicle disappear down the road. Then, Lisa turned to Jake with a small, bittersweet smile. "You did good, Doc." Jake let out a slow breath. "We did." And though the clinic felt emptier, he knew in his heart that they had done exactly what was right. The clinic had returned to its usual rhythm, but for Jake Thompson, something felt different. The familiar sounds of ringing phones, soft chatter, and the occasional bark or meow filled the air, yet a quiet absence lingered in the back of his mind. 1 week had passed since the coyote pup had been transferred to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The days had been filled with checkups, vaccinations, and surgeries. Yet every so often, Jake found himself glancing toward the back room, half expecting to see a tiny pair of bright, curious eyes watching him. Molly, finishing up at the reception desk, caught his gaze and gave him a knowing smile. "Thinking about him again, aren't you?" Jake exhaled, setting down a patient's chart. "Hard not to." She nodded. "Me too." They had both known from the start that this wasn't a rescue that would end with a cozy adoption, but knowing something logically didn't make it any easier emotionally. The soft jingle of the clinic doorbell interrupted their conversation. Jake turned to see a familiar figure step inside Ranger Moore. His uniform was dusty from a long day in the field, but his expression was light. "Dr. Thompson," Moore greeted with a nod. "Thought I'd stop by with an update." Jake's heart skipped slightly. "How's he doing?" Molly stepped closer, eager to hear. Ranger Moore smiled. "Better than we could have hoped." He settled in quickly at the rehab center. Took to the other young coyotes without issue. The specialists say he's already showing strong natural instincts, tracking, scenting, even roughhousing like he should. He'll be a candidate for release in a few months if all goes well. Relief flooded through Jake, and for the first time in days, the weight on his chest lightened. He exchanged a glance with Molly, whose eyes shone with emotion. "That's great news," she said, voice thick with gratitude. Moore crossed his arms. "Figured you'd want to know. It's rare that one so young survives without a mother, but thanks to you two, he's got a real shot." Jake let out a slow breath, a small, genuine smile breaking through. "That's all we ever wanted for him." Moore nodded. "You did right by him. And hey, if you ever want another update, just give the center a call. I'm sure they'd be happy to let you know how he's doing." Jake shook the ranger's hand. "Thanks, Moore. Really." As the ranger left, Jake felt something shift within him. It wasn't just closure, it was peace. The pup wasn't just surviving. He was thriving. Molly nudged him playfully. "You okay?" He chuckled softly. Yeah, I think I am." Life at the clinic would continue, as it always did. But for a brief moment, as he glanced toward the back room one last time, Jake let himself remember the tiny, fragile life they had fought for and the wild spirit they had set free. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Jake Thompson stepped out of the clinic for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. The sky was a soft shade of blue, and the gentle rustling of trees outside reminded him that life moved forward, always. Back inside, Molly busied herself at the reception desk, efficiently managing appointments. She glanced up as Jake re-entered, offering a knowing smile. Though neither of them spoke about it much, they both still felt the absence of the small coyote pup they had nurtured back to health. As he reviewed patient files, Jake's phone vibrated on his desk. A new message from Dr. Novak. Good news! Our little survivor is progressing well. He's taking to the group seamlessly. Looks like he's right where he belongs. Attached was a short video. Jake tapped to play, and his chest tightened with unexpected emotion as he watched. The young coyote darted through the grass, playfully nipping at another pup before pausing to lift its nose to the sky. A second later, it let out a small, tentative howl. The sound, though soft, carried the unmistakable promise of something greater, a wild spirit stepping into its own. Molly peeked over his shoulder. Wow, she murmured, her eyes glistening. That's incredible. Jake exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. Yeah, it really is. Here was a time, not long ago, when he had feared letting go. But seeing the pup now strong, independent, thriving, it solidified everything. They had done the right thing. The day carried on with its usual rhythm. A golden retriever bounded into the exam room, wagging its tail wildly, followed by an elderly cat whose quiet demeanor starkly contrasted the dog's enthusiasm. Between routine checkups and a minor surgery, Jake remained fully immersed in his work, but the images from Dr. Novak's update stayed in the back of his mind, offering a quiet reassurance. Later in the afternoon, as the last appointment wrapped up, Jake found himself standing at the backroom doorway. The space had been returned to its original function, storage for medical supplies, but to him, it would always be more than that. It was the place where an unexpected journey had unfolded, where a fragile life had been saved, and where he had learned the delicate balance between care and release. Molly appeared beside him, holding a folded blanket, the pup's favorite, the one she hadn't yet been able to part with. She looked at Jake, then at the shelf where it had been stored all this time. With a quiet nod, she stepped forward and carefully placed it inside a donation box meant for the local animal shelter. Jake smiled at her. Let's keep doing what we do best. She grinned. Helping those who need us, then letting them go when it's time? He nodded. Exactly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm hues across Willow Creek, the clinic doors closed for the evening, and with them, a chapter ended, not in sadness, but in gratitude. The early morning air was crisp as Jake Thompson guided his truck along the winding gravel road leading to the sanctuary. Molly sat beside him, cradling a travel mug of coffee, her fingers wrapped tightly around it. Fallen leaves swirled in their wake, painting the road in hues of red and gold. Neither of them spoke much, but the quiet between them wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken emotions, anticipation, and the bittersweet weight of the day ahead. Almost there, Jake murmured, glancing at the GPS one last time. The sanctuary stretched across hundreds of protected acres, an expanse of wild terrain dedicated to rehabilitation and release. As they rounded a bend, a cluster of vehicles came into view: Dr. Novak's SUV Ranger, Mike's official truck, and Officer Klein's department vehicle. This was it. Dr. Novak greeted them with a warm smile, clipboard tucked under one arm. Perfect timing, she said, motioning for them to follow. He's ready. Jake's breath hitched as they neared the large enclosure. There, standing tall and strong, was the coyote they had nursed back to life. Gone was the frail, trembling pup they had first taken in. In its place stood a stunning young coyote, its thick coat a blend of gray and tawny, its posture proud and alert. Molly exhaled softly. Look at him, she whispered. He is beautiful. The coyote's ears twitched at her voice. For a fleeting moment, its sharp eyes met theirs. Was there recognition in that gaze? A lingering thread of familiarity? Or was it simply wild curiosity? Jake swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Ranger Mike and Officer Klein stepped forward, nodding in quiet respect. They had seen enough cases to know how rare it was for a wild animal to make it to this moment healthy, independent, and ready to return home. Dr. Novak flipped through her notes. He's been hunting successfully in the enclosure, forming natural social behaviors, and showing the right amount of wariness toward humans. He's ready. She moved toward the gate, her motions slow and deliberate. The coyote tensed, muscles coiling, every instinct honed for survival. The gate swung open. For a long moment, the coyote didn't move. It stood at the threshold, nose lifting to catch the scent of the wind, ears flicking at the rustling leaves. The gathered humans held their breath. Then, with quiet confidence, the coyote stepped forward. Its paws touched the dewy grass at the forest's edge, and it hesitated only briefly. It turned one last time, golden eyes sweeping across the faces that had been its entire world. Jake didn't move. His heart swelled with pride and something deeper, something almost like loss, but also peace. And then, in one fluid motion, the coyote slipped into the underbrush. Molly reached for Jake's hand, tears silently streaming down her face. He squeezed back, his own vision blurring. They stood together, watching as their former patient disappeared into the dappled shadows of the forest, where it belonged. The moment held everything, the fear, the hope, the difficult choices, and, in the end, the undeniable rightness of it all. Jake exhaled. "We did good." Molly nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Yeah, we did." And as they turned back toward the sanctuary, they knew their story with this coyote had come to an end. But out there, in the wild, another one was just beginning. Jake Thompson's journey with the coyote pup is more than just a story of rescue and rehabilitation. It's a powerful metaphor for the difficult choices we all face in life. His emotional struggle between caring for the pup and ultimately releasing it into the wild reflects a universal challenge, knowing when to hold on and when to let go. In life, we often encounter situations where we become deeply attached to relationships, careers, dreams, or even habits that may no longer serve us. Just like Jake, we pour our hearts into nurturing something, investing time, energy, and love, only to reach a point where we realize that holding on may not be in its or our best interest. The lesson here is one of selflessness and acceptance. True care isn't about keeping something for ourselves. It's about doing what's right, even when it hurts. Just as Jake and Molly ensured the coyote had everything it needed to thrive before letting it go, we must recognize when it's time to step back and trust that we have done our part. In our personal and professional lives, this could mean letting go of toxic relationships, moving on from a job that no longer aligns with our values, or releasing expectations that weigh us down. Growth often requires discomfort, and just like the coyote stepping into the unknown, we must embrace uncertainty to reach our full potential. So, ask yourself, what are you holding on to that might be holding you back? Sometimes, the greatest act of love for others and ourselves is the courage to let go. Trust that what's meant to be free will find its way, just like Jake's coyote did, disappearing into the wild where it was always meant to be. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances and the unbreakable bond between animals and humans. Let's spread the message of love, hope, and the power of finding home in the most unexpected places.